Victory in 1763 didn't just bring new land, it ignited a terrifying belief, a divine right of conquest. Suddenly, Native Americans weren't just former adversaries, they were branded savages, mere obstacles to be swept aside from their ancestral homes. Stories of their supposed brutality were twisted and amplified, painting them as less than human. How do you even begin to fight for your existence when your very humanity is denied by conquerors who believe God sanctioned their expansion? The tapestry of the mid-18th century in North America was increasingly stained by the ambitions of two European superpowers, Great Britain and France. Their imperial rivalry, a constant simmer across the globe, boiled over into a continental struggle for dominance known as the French and Indian War. This conflict, initiated by border clashes in 1754, formally became a part of the wider 7 Years' War that engulfed Europe and its colonies from 1756 to 1763. At its heart, the North American contest was a fight for control over vast, resource-rich territories, with the fertile Ohio River Valley serving as a principal flashpoint. Both empires sought to expand their influence and secure the lucrative fur trade, setting them on an unavoidable collision course that would escalate from minor skirmishes to full-scale warfare, marked by pivotal engagements such as the Battle of Quebec in 1759 and the subsequent fall of Montreal in 1760. For the Native American nations inhabiting these contested lands, the war was far more than a distant European quarrel. It was a profound and existential crisis, considered by many historians to be the single most consequential conflict in the history of Native American presence in colonial North America. The war's outcome would irrevocably shatter existing power structures, upend long-standing alliances, and drastically curtail the autonomy and negotiating capacity of numerous tribes, particularly those residing east of the Mississippi River. Their ancestral lands, their ways of life, and their very futures hung in the balance, dependent on the clash of empires. The primary combatants, Britain and France, did not wage this war in isolation. Native American tribes played crucial, multifaceted roles, acting as indispensable allies to both European powers. The British forged a significant, though often strained, alliance with the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, which comprised several distinct nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, and Seneca. This allegiance was rooted in complex trade relationships and a shared animosity towards French-allied tribes. Conversely, the French cultivated extensive alliances with a multitude of Algonquin-speaking peoples. This formidable coalition included the Wabanaki Confederacy, Mi'kmaq, Abenaki, and others, the Ojibwa, Lenape, Ottawa, and Shawnee. These nations generally viewed the French, with their comparatively smaller colonial footprint and less aggressive land acquisition policies, as a vital counterweight to the relentless westward expansion of British settlement. Native participation extended far beyond mere military support. Warriors provided essential intelligence on enemy movements, unparalleled local knowledge of the difficult terrain, and tactical expertise in forest warfare that European armies struggled to match. The proximate cause of the French and Indian War lay in the escalating territorial disputes over the Ohio River Valley. Both Britain and France laid claim to this strategically vital region, recognizing its importance for controlling inland waterways and the fur trade. The simmering tensions erupted into open conflict in 1754. On May 28, a contingent of Virginia provincial militia, under the command of a 22-year-old Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, ambushed a small French diplomatic and reconnaissance party led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville in a wooded glen. Jumonville and several of his men were killed in the brief, brutal encounter. This event, the Battle of Jumonville Glen, acted as the catalyst for wider hostilities. Compounding the issue was the French construction of Fort Duquesne at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the site of modern-day Pittsburgh, a direct challenge to British claims in the region. These frontier confrontations, particularly the Jumonville incident, provided Britain with the pretext to formally declare war on France in 1756, transforming a colonial brushfire into a global conflagration. In the initial stages of the war, Native American allies were instrumental to French military successes. Tribes such as the Ottawa and Shawnee, masters of wilderness warfare, provided the French with highly effective light infantry, expert guides, and a constant stream of intelligence. Their warriors, armed with a combination of traditional weapons and European trade muskets like the Forey, 62 caliber Toul fusil de chasse, executed devastating ambushes and raids against British forces and frontier settlements. A prime example of their impact was the Battle of the Monongahela on the 9th of July, 1755. A combined force of French regulars, Canadian militia, and approximately 600 native warriors ambushed Major General Edward Braddock's column of 300 British regulars and colonial militia as they advanced on Fort Duquesne. Braddock's force, caught in dense forest and unable to effectively deploy their traditional linear tactics, suffered catastrophic losses. Braddock himself was mortally wounded, and his army was routed with over 900 casualties. While some native groups, notably elements of the Iroquois Confederacy, maintained their alliance with the British due to established trade links and historical rivalries with French allied tribes, the majority of indigenous nations initially saw supporting France as their best strategy for preserving their lands and autonomy against the tide of British colonial expansion. The complex web of Native American alliances during the French and Indian War was not a product of capricious decision-making, but a direct consequence of the fundamentally different colonial philosophies and practices employed by Great Britain and France. Grasping these divergent approaches to land, settlement, trade, and indigenous relations is crucial to understanding why a significant majority of tribes, especially those in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes regions, ultimately sided with the French. While the British pursued a strategy often described as an exclusionary frontier aimed at displacement and replacement, the French, largely out of demographic and economic necessity, adopted a more inclusive frontier, fostering interdependence. The British colonial enterprise in North America was characterized by an insatiable appetite for land and a drive to establish dense, permanent agricultural settlements. Their objective was to replicate the social and economic structures of England, transforming the wilderness into a landscape of farms, villages, and towns, primarily along the Atlantic seaboard, but with an ever-increasing push westward into the interior. This expansion was fueled by a rapidly growing colonial population, which by 1750 numbered around 1.5 million. The British policy of dense settlement inherently led to the systematic dispossession of Native American populations. As colonial holdings in regions like Virginia and Pennsylvania expanded, they inevitably encroached upon the traditional territories of tribes such as the Lenape and Shawnee, leading to escalating friction and conflict. Within this British vision of a New England, Native Americans were largely perceived as an impediment, an obstacle to be removed rather than incorporated. They were deemed unsuitable for assimilation into British colonial society and were systematically excluded from development plans. This aggressive, exclusionary approach had already precipitated numerous earlier conflicts, such as the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717 in South Carolina, where native confederacies rose up to resist British encroachment and exploitative trade practices. Conversely, the French colonial model in North America presented a starkly different picture. French settlements were primarily concentrated along the St. Lawrence River Valley, with Quebec City, population around 8,000 in 1750. and Montreal, population around 5,000 in 1750, serving as key urban centers. From this core, French influence extended westward through a network of strategically placed forts and trading posts into the Great Lakes Basin and down the Mississippi River Valley to Louisiana. Crucially, the French colonial population was vastly smaller than that of their British rivals, numbering only about 55,000 in Canada and another 9,000 in Louisiana by 1750. This significant demographic disparity, nearly 27-to-1 disadvantage compared to the British colonies, made peaceful coexistence and active alliances with Native American nations not just a matter of policy, but of existential necessity for the French. Their empire in North America was built less on widespread agricultural settlement and more on the lucrative fur trade and the maintenance of strategic military alliances. To survive and prosper, the French actively sought to integrate Native Americans into their colonial system. They established trading posts, such as Fort de Chartres in the Illinois country or Fort Detroit, which served as hubs for commerce and diplomacy rather than as vanguards for large-scale European settlement. The French colonial administration understood that their presence depended on native cooperation. This inclusive frontier fostered a degree of mutual dependency. While not a relationship of equals, it often involved French officials, traders, coureurs des bois, and even military personnel living in close proximity to native communities, learning their languages and sometimes forming kinship ties through intermarriage practice, far less common and generally discouraged in the British colonies. The roles of Native Americans within the French imperial structure were multifaceted. Economically, they were indispensable partners in the fur trade. Canada's exports consisted of between 200,000 and 400,000 pelts annually, primarily beaver, which accounted for as much as 70% of the total value of exports from the colony. Native hunters and trappers were the primary producers in this vast commercial network. Religiously, French Jesuit missionaries established missions like Sainte Marie among the Hurons, established in the 1630s, in an effort to convert native populations to Catholicism. While these efforts yielded relatively few permanent converts, perhaps only a few hundred across the vast territories, they did contribute to cultural exchange and, in some cases, solidified alliances. Militarily, Native American warriors were essential allies. They provided the French with the bulk of their light infantry forces, possessing intimate knowledge of the terrain and mastery of wilderness warfare techniques that often gave French-led forces a tactical edge over larger British formations, as demonstrated at the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755. This intricate system of trade, diplomacy, and military cooperation underpinned the Franco-Native alliances, creating a formidable, if ultimately fragile, bulwark against British expansionism. The pronounced preference of most Native American nations, particularly the diverse Algonquin-speaking peoples, for an alliance with France over Great Britain was a pragmatic calculation rooted in observable differences in colonial conduct and intent. From the native perspective, the French generally presented a less immediate existential threat and a more respectful reciprocal engagement compared to the land-hungry British. This preference was not based on sentimentality, but on a clear-eyed assessment of which European power better aligned with their own strategic interests in preserving territorial integrity and traditional ways of life. A primary factor was the French colonial economy's focus on the fur trade rather than large-scale agricultural settlement. This commercial imperative meant that French interests often coincided with the native desire to maintain their ancestral hunting grounds and existing societal structures. Unlike the British, whose expanding agricultural frontier inexorably consumed native lands, the French did not typically engage in widespread deforestation or the establishment of sprawling farmsteads. Instead, French presence in the interior often manifested as a network of strategically placed forts, such as Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, the site of modern Pittsburgh, or the vital choke point of Fort Niagara, controlling access to the western Great Lakes. These forts served not primarily as vanguards of settlement, but as hubs for trade, diplomacy, and missionary activity, facilitating interaction and cooperation with tribes like the Montagnais, Algonquin, and Huron. In vast regions like the Mississippi Valley, the French and indigenous groups such as the Choctaw forged durable relationships based on intricate webs of commerce and mutual military support, often coexisting in a shared landscape rather than one of stark displacement. The French actively cultivated and maintained these alliances through sophisticated diplomatic practices, prominently featuring ritualized gift-giving and carefully managed trade. Annual ceremonies, often held at major centers like Montreal or Mobile, involved the distribution of European goods-wool blankets, iron tools and cookware, firearms like the .62 caliber fusil de chasse, powder, and lead which had become increasingly integrated into native economies and material culture. These were not mere handouts, but symbolic affirmations of political and military partnerships. French officials sometimes knowingly accepted unfavorable terms of trade or operated trade networks at a loss to secure or retain the loyalty of key tribal partners, understanding that the strategic benefits of alliance outweighed immediate economic deficits. This contrasted sharply with British traders, who were often perceived as exploitative and less willing to engage in the reciprocal obligations central to native diplomacy. Furthermore, the relatively small French colonial population, numbering only about 64,000 settlers in Canada and Louisiana, combined by 1750, compared to over 1.5 million in the British colonies, paradoxically offered native nations a degree of leverage. Indigenous peoples recognized that the French were numerically inferior and thus more reliant on their support. This imbalance meant that native leaders and communities could often exert considerable influence over French policy and actions in the interior. If French demands became too onerous or their presence too intrusive, native groups possessed a credible capacity to resist or withdraw cooperation, effectively pushing back against French authority. For instance, powerful southern nations like the Choctaw skillfully navigated the imperial rivalry, sometimes using the proximity and potential alliance with British traders in Carolina or Georgia to negotiate more favorable terms or greater autonomy from their French partners in Louisiana. Ultimately, the Franco-Native alliance was built upon a foundation of mutual, though asymmetric, dependence. The French required Native American participation to sustain the fur trade, their primary economic engine in North America, and crucially, they needed native warriors to defend their vast territorial claims against the numerically superior British. Conversely, Native American nations sought access to European trade goods, particularly firearms, metal tools, and textiles, which had become integral to their societies. They also valued French military support in their own conflicts with rival indigenous groups and as a counterforce against the ever-advancing British colonial frontier. This intricate interplay of shared interests, tempered by a clear understanding of power dynamics, formed the resilient core of the Franco-Native alliance system that characterized much of North America prior to 1763. The decisive phase of the French and Indian War in North America culminated in a series of British victories that shattered French colonial power. The tide turned significantly with the British capture of Louisbourg in 1758, followed by the pivotal Battle of the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City in the 17th of September 59, where both commanding generals, James Wolfe for the British and Louis-Joseph de Montcalm for the French, were mortally wounded. Quebec, the heart of New France, fell to the British shortly thereafter. The final major act in the North American theater occurred in the 17th of September 60, when British forces under the command of General Geoffrey Amherst converged on Montreal from 3 directions. Facing overwhelming odds and with no hope of reinforcement, the French governor, Pierre de Rigaud, Marquis de Vaudreuil-Cavagnal, surrendered the city and all of New France to Great Britain. While sporadic fighting continued elsewhere, major hostilities in North America largely ceased with Montreal's capitulation. The global 7 Years' War officially concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on the 10th of February, 1763. The terms of the treaty were devastating for France. It ceded all of its North American mainland territories east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain, including Canada and the Ohio Valley. New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi were transferred to Spain, France's ally, in a separate agreement, the Treaty of Fontainebleau, 1762, as compensation for Spain's own losses. Spain, in turn, ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana, Cuba, which the British had captured during the war. The treaty effectively expelled France from the North American continent, leaving only a few small islands in the Caribbean and fishing rights off Newfoundland. This dramatic redrawing of the map ended France's imperial ambitions in the region and created a power vacuum that Great Britain moved swiftly to fill. For the Native American nations, the consequences of the French defeat and the Treaty of Paris were catastrophic, ushering in a new and profoundly challenging reality. The departure of the French meant the loss of a crucial ally and a vital counterweight to British power. Tribes such as the Ottawa, Shawnee, Lenape, and others who had allied with France now found themselves facing a victorious and often vindictive British Empire, whose aggressive colonial policies and disdain for native sovereignty were well known. The intricate imperial balance of power, which native leaders had skillfully exploited for generations to maintain a degree of autonomy and control over their lands, was shattered. Previously, nations like the Iroquois Confederacy, the peoples of the Great Lakes region, and the inhabitants of the Ohio Valley had been able to play the British and French against each other, negotiating treaties, securing favorable trade terms, and preserving their political independence. The Iroquois, for example, had long employed a playoff system, or a policy of nominal neutrality to maximize their influence and protect their territory. With France gone, this leverage vanished completely. Native peoples were no longer indispensable allies or valuable trading partners in a contested imperial landscape. They were increasingly viewed by the British simply as obstacles to westward expansion. The immediate and visceral reaction to this altered geopolitical landscape was Pontiac's rebellion, which erupted in the spring of 1763, even before many Western tribes fully comprehended the terms of the Treaty of Paris. This widespread indigenous uprising, named after one of its most prominent leaders, the Ottawa war chief Pontiac, involved a confederation of tribes including the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, Ojibwa, Miami, and Potawatomi. Fueled by discontent with British policies, particularly General Amherst's curtailment of gift-giving, restrictions on trade in gunpowder and ammunition, and the aggressive encroachment of settlers' native warriors, launched coordinated attacks against British forts and settlements throughout the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley. In a stunning series of victories, they captured 8 out of the 12 major British forts west of the Appalachians, including Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph, Fort Miami, Fort Ouiatenon, and Fort Michilimackinac. Fort Pitt, formerly Fort Duquesne, and Fort Detroit endured lengthy sieges. Pontiac's rebellion was a desperate and bloody attempt to resist British domination and reclaim native autonomy, starkly illustrating the profound sense of crisis and betrayal felt by indigenous peoples in the wake of the French withdrawal. The British victory in the 7 Years' War imbued Anglo-American colonists with an invigorated sense of confidence and an unyielding conviction in their entitlement to westward expansion. The defeat of France, and by extension its native allies, was interpreted not merely as a military triumph, but as a divine sanction of British dominion over North America. This mindset became a powerful undercurrent, shaping colonial ambitions and interactions with indigenous populations for generations to come. A core component of this burgeoning imperial confidence was the articulation of a right of conquest. British authorities and colonial thinkers began to assert a perceived legal and moral authority to seize and possess native lands, predicated on the European concept that victory in war conferred ownership of the vanquished's territory. This notion, while not entirely new, gained significant traction and ideological weight in the post-1763 landscape, laying a conceptual foundation for what would later crystallize in the 19th century as the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief in an inevitable, divinely ordained American expansion across the continent. The 7 Years' War, therefore, marked a crucial juncture where the idea of territorial expansion became increasingly central to the Anglo-American identity and future aspirations. Prominent colonial figures such as Benjamin Franklin and George Washington actively championed the settlement and economic exploitation of newly accessible regions, particularly the Ohio River Valley, viewing it as essential for the growth and prosperity of the colonies. This created immense pressure from land speculators, traders, and ordinary settlers to push beyond the established colonial frontiers into areas like northern New York, the Trans-Appalachian West, and the rich lands of the Ohio Country. In an attempt to manage this expansionist fervor and prevent further costly conflicts with Native American nations, many of whom were still reeling from the war and resentful of British encroachment, the British Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This decree, delivered by King George III, formally prohibited Anglo-American settlement west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, designating these lands as reserved for indigenous use. However, the proclamation line proved largely unenforceable. Many colonists, emboldened by their recent victory and hungry for land, openly defied the edict, pouring into the restricted territories. This disregard for imperial authority and native land rights inevitably led to renewed violence and conflict, such as Dunmore's War in 1774, which saw Virginia militia clash with Shawnee and Mingo warriors in the Ohio Valley. Accompanying this aggressive physical expansion was an intensified campaign of ideological justification, which often involved the systematic dehumanization of Native American peoples. British colonial discourse increasingly portrayed indigenous populations as savages, barbarians, and implacable enemies of civilization to legitimize the seizure of their lands. Narratives of native violence, including accounts of massacres and the practice of scalping, were frequently exaggerated and widely circulated by colonial authorities and the nascent colonial press. For instance, reports surrounding the events at Fort William Henry in 1757, where native allies of the French were accused of killing disarmed British prisoners and civilians after the fort's surrender, were sensationalized to stoke anti-native sentiment and unify colonial opinion against them. This dehumanization served several strategic purposes. It aimed to undermine native territorial claims by depicting their lands as vacant or underutilized by peoples who supposedly did not practice civilized forms of agriculture or land management according to European norms. This reflected a deeply ingrained European colonial mindset that often equated legitimate land ownership with intensive cultivation and permanent settlement in the European style, effectively invalidating indigenous systems of land tenure and resource use. The experience of the 7 Years' War added another layer to this justification. Native Americans, having largely allied with the defeated French, were now cast not just as culturally different, but as conquered enemies who had forfeited their rights. Colonial propaganda of the era consistently emphasized alleged native atrocities to build support for military campaigns, punitive expeditions, and the continued appropriation of indigenous territory. The widespread dissemination of stories focusing on massacres and cruelty helped to foster a colonial consensus that native peoples were inherently untrustworthy and undeserving of the lands they occupied. The practice of scalping, for example, was frequently highlighted as a uniquely savage native custom, despite the fact that it was a practice engaged in by both Europeans and Native Americans in various colonial conflicts. Indeed, colonial governments, including the British, had previously offered bounties for the scalps of enemy Native Americans during conflicts like King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, and the French had also encouraged the practice among their native allies during the 7 Years' War itself. Yet, in the post-1763 narrative, it was selectively emphasized to reinforce the image of native barbarity. This purposeful vilification provided a convenient moral and legal pretext for the British to assert control over the Ohio Valley and other contested regions, claiming that their victory bestowed upon them the right and responsibility to impose order on a supposedly lawless frontier. The 7 Years' War thus stands as a pivotal turning point, not only for its geopolitical ramifications but for its profound and devastating impact on Native American sovereignty, land tenure, and cultural integrity, initiating a period of accelerated dispossession and marginalization that would continue for centuries. Reconstructing the experiences and perspectives of Native American peoples during the 17th and 18th centuries, including the tumultuous era of the 7 Years' War, presents formidable challenges for historians. The overwhelming majority of surviving documentary evidence from this period was produced by European colonial administrators, military officers, missionaries, traders, and settlers. These sources, which include official reports, military dispatches, personal diaries, letters, and religious chronicles like the Jesuit Relations, inevitably reflect the cultural biases, political agendas, and limited understanding of their authors. European observers often viewed native societies through a lens of ethnocentrism, interpreting complex indigenous political systems, social customs, and spiritual beliefs in ways that were frequently distorted, oversimplified, or overtly hostile. Consequently, the voices and viewpoints of Native Americans themselves are often muted, filtered, or entirely absent from the primary written record. This scarcity of direct indigenous-authored textual sources from the period constitutes a fundamental challenge in the study of Native American history. Without access to native written accounts, contemporary interviews, or direct transcriptions of indigenous perspectives on events like the 7 Years' War, historians must employ a range of alternative methodologies and critically interrogate the available European sources to approximate a more nuanced understanding. This requires a careful deconstruction of colonial narratives, recognizing their inherent limitations and biases, and looking for indirect clues or voices from the margins that might illuminate Native agency and experience. To navigate these challenges, historians and researchers utilize several supportive tools and approaches. A crucial element is developing a deep understanding of the specific cultural contexts of the Native nations involved, such as the Iroquois, Ottawa, Shawnee, Cherokee, and others. By studying their languages, social structures, political systems, kinship networks, belief systems, and diplomatic protocols, scholars can better infer how these communities might have perceived and responded to the rapidly changing circumstances brought about by European colonization and imperial warfare. For example, understanding indigenous concepts of kinship alliances, where relationships were often forged and maintained through reciprocal gift exchange, intermarriage, and shared ceremony, helps to explain why many tribes found French diplomatic approaches, which often incorporated these elements, more amenable than the more legalistic and less personal style of the British. Collaboration with contemporary Native American communities and descendants is also increasingly recognized as an invaluable resource. Many indigenous nations, such as the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Confederacy, or various Anishinaabe, Ojibwa communities, possess rich oral histories and traditions that have preserved community memories and interpretations of historical events like the 7 Years' War. These oral traditions encompassing stories, songs, epic poems, and ceremonial speeches passed down through generations offer vital perspectives that are often absent from the written colonial archive. For instance, oral histories recorded by anthropologists in the 20th century among the Lenape, Delaware. People contain detailed accounts of their experiences of land loss and displacement following the Treaty of Paris, providing a counter-narrative to official colonial records. When working with European-authored sources, a critical analytical approach is paramount. Documents such as the Jesuit Relations Detailed Annual Reports written by Jesuit missionaries in New France from 1610 to 1791 provide a wealth of ethnographic information about native life, customs, and languages. However, these accounts must be read with an acute awareness of the missionaries' primary objective, the conversion of indigenous peoples to Catholicism. This religious agenda often colored their descriptions, leading them to portray native spiritual practices as idolatry or superstition, and to frame native peoples as savages in need of Christian salvation. Similarly, the reports of colonial officials or military commanders were often drafted to serve specific political or personal interests, such as justifying particular policies, exaggerating military successes, or demonizing native adversaries to garner support for further colonial expansion or punitive actions. Historians must therefore meticulously scrutinize the motivations of the author, the intended audience, and the context in which a document was created, cross-referencing information with other sources whenever possible to identify biases and potential inaccuracies. Particular vigilance is required when encountering European descriptions of native character and behavior, especially concerning violence or alleged savagery. As noted earlier, portrayals of Native Americans in colonial texts often serve to justify European aggression and dispossession. For example, accounts of Pontiac's rebellion frequently magnified native attacks on British forts and settlements while downplaying or ignoring preceding British provocations, land encroachments, or comparable acts of violence committed by colonial militias or settlers against native non-combatants. By critically engaging with the available sources, incorporating indigenous oral traditions, and employing culturally sensitive analytical frameworks, historians strive to reconstruct a more complete and multivocal understanding of the past, endeavoring to restore agency and voice to the Native American peoples whose lives were so profoundly impacted by the imperial struggles of the 18th century. The 7 Years' War irrevocably altered North America's destiny. Its conclusion marked not an end to conflict, but the onset of new struggles for land and autonomy. The repercussions of these events shaped the continent's development for centuries. What overlooked aspect of this era do you believe warrants more attention?